Good afternoon, and to some of us, good morning. Wanted to welcome you to this spotlight session of our Ideas Lab 2021 with the topic, the future of global climate change policies. And I'm joined here by two experts who will be advising and making the policy for two of the largest emitters and most important economies of the world. David Livingston, who joins us from Washington, D.C. Many thanks, David, for getting up early for us. And Jakob Werksman, who works much more close to home here in Brussels at the European Commission. Unfortunately, we lost Minister Stentje van Veldhoven, who has been called to the Dutch Parliament at the last minute. The Parliament, of course, wouldn't take our event as an excuse for allowing her not to appear. I had intended to have a discussion first with the Minister on how the EU is preparing itself as a background to the global climate change negotiations. And since we have Jakob here, who is the expert on the EU side, I wanted therefore to take a few minutes to engage him on where he sees the EU heading on its own, if you want, internal side. Because while the overall goal of combating climate change is clear to everybody, there have been commitments made, the EU now has broad commitments, but of course we have a large panoply of instruments and sub-targets, and all of that plays also into the global climate change negotiations. Therefore, perhaps the first question I have for you, Jakob, is one cornerstone of the EU's Green Deal, broadly speaking, is the ETS, the European Trading System, which is, of course, the part that might become most relevant also globally. It is intimately linked to the question of a carbon border adjustment and how we can make industry greener without subsidizing them, having the polluter pay. Could you perhaps give us a quick survey or a summary of to what extent is the Green Deal much more than just the ETS?
Thanks a lot. Happy to, and also very sorry to have missed the minister's remarks. As you say, she would have helped frame the domestic policy issues in the EU. My work at the European Commission in advising the Directorate General for Climate Action is much more focused on the international dimension. But as your question points out, there are clearly links between the two. The Commission at the moment is in the process of rolling out the details of how it is that we intend to achieve the big overarching targets that the EU set for itself. Becoming net zero by 2050 in terms of all of our greenhouse gas emissions, and achieving on the pathway to net zero an at least 55% emissions reduction by 2030. This is all part of the European Green Deal commitments that this Commission came forward with almost 2 years ago now, and with the support of the European Parliament and the European Council. But now we're in the process of laying out the much more specific plans of how we're going to achieve that first set of emissions reductions in the decade ahead. And that's something that we call the Fit for 55% package. And it will be published as a Commission proposal the middle of July of this year. For those of you who understand the way in which the policy-making machinery works within the EU, the Commission has the sole right to initiate legislation, but it only becomes law when it is approved by the European Council, that is the European ministers and sometimes leaders, and the European Parliament, the directly elected part of the European government. A key part of that architecture of the Fit for 55 will continue to rely on the EU emissions trading system, the EU ETS, to achieve emissions reductions from the sectors that the ETS covers. And that's essentially the power sector and the manufacturing sector, where still a significant chunk of EU greenhouse gases are emitted. It's a cap and trade system, so it includes an absolute emissions reduction target from those sectors. That's the cap, but it allows covered entities within that cap to trade amongst themselves in order to achieve maximum cost effectiveness in the way in which they achieve those emissions reductions. So expect the Fit for 55 process to have, as part of the Commission's proposals, the ETS as a core part of that architecture from 2020 to 2030, but with a tightening of the targets. As we moved from our previous target of at least 40% to now at least 55, you can expect the emissions reduction trajectories forced by that cap to decline at a more significant rate. There may be some adjustments to what the ETS covers. This is still being discussed within the Commission and will only become clear in terms of its final details when those proposals are published in middle of July. There's been some discussion as to whether this tool of a cap and trade system could also effectively regulate emissions in other sectors. So there may be some proposals in that context, but it will still be only one part of a much bigger architecture. It was clear from the outset from the ETS that it alone, even in terms of the sectors that it covers, can't be relied upon exclusively to achieve a pathway towards net zero ambitions. You have to flank the ETS in the way in which it sends a carbon price and establishes a cap with other forms of policies. So, for example, you can expect, as part of the Fit for 55 package, renewed targets on the increase of renewable energy in the EU's energy mix, targets to improve energy efficiency, and policies that begin to address the need to electrify the transport sector and to reform the building sector to make it more energy efficiency, and also to tackle challenging emissions from land use and agriculture and forestry as well. So those complementary policies will be in place too, some of which touch upon the same industries that are covered by the cap as well. So it's a combination of all of those policies that we'll be continuing to rely upon, but at an enhanced level of ambition necessary to get us onto that at least 55% path and then on towards net zero.
Daniel, you need to unmute yourself.
I apologize, rookie mistake. As you mentioned earlier, the ETS is still a central plank. Is it not also the one plank which plays a crucial role in climate diplomacy? Does it matter for your climate negotiations how much you do, let's say, to insulate buildings?
Well, I mean, the way it affects our international climate diplomacy is by establishing the European Union as a major player in carbon markets. So other jurisdictions that are developing carbon markets, such as China, such as New Zealand, look to the over a decade-long experiment that the EU has been going under through the ETS to design their own emissions trading systems. And then, of course, those of you who are following the Paris Agreement negotiations know that we are in the process of trying to develop rules that ensure transparency and accountability if different jurisdictions decide to link their domestic carbon markets through international carbon market trading. And so it affects our international diplomacy in that sense as well. It is the means by which we indicate to other jurisdictions what the prevailing carbon price is within the EU. So in that sense, they can use it as a kind of a rough benchmark for the intensity of the way in which we're regulating greenhouse gas emissions reductions, at least within those sectors. So in that sense, it also, I guess, plays a role in diplomacy as well.
You're right that the ETS price, in principle, is both a diplomatic signal and it should be an economic signal as well to operators. But if you look at it more closely, you find that actually, so far, one of the sectors covered by the ETS, namely manufacturing, which you mentioned earlier, has obtained all of its emission certificates for free. And the entire brunt of the adjustment had been borne by the power sector. So in a sense, our industry, our manufacturing industry, so far has been totally shielded from the carbon price. Is it not a bit too late to prepare them for the future? You just muted yourself.
Sorry about that, rookie mistake by me. No, I don't think it's fair to say that those parts of EU industry that have been able to, up to now, receive their allocation of allowances for free have been shielded from the carbon price. Certainly, they haven't been shielded from the operation of the ETS, because within these ETS, as I've described, they've been required to comply with an increasingly tightening cap on those emissions. And while they can, it's true that they can achieve that cap in part through using allocations that they receive for free rather than through the auctioning process, they still have to remain within that cap, and that implies costs. And we've seen the impact of those compliance costs on those industries and in the way in which they've been adjusting their manufacturing processes and improving their energy efficiency and their demand for renewable energy as well from the electricity production sector. So they haven't been entirely free. It is true that the free allocation of allowances has been the main tool that the EU has used thus far to make sure that as we regulate, as we enforce this cap domestically, that our industry supply chains don't shift in such a way so that we begin to source the same goods from overseas and as a result increase emissions overall. This is the phenomenon of carbon leakage, which we've been concerned about from the outset in our climate change policy, and that we continue to be concerned about as the EU takes the lead in moving towards net zero. So even from the early days of the Kyoto Protocol, when the EU was bound by international emissions reduction targets, and many of our trading partners were not, we were concerned that by taking the lead, we might end up undermining the effectiveness of our own environmental policies by allowing for this phenomenon of carbon leakage. So free allocation was a way in which we could cap emissions without imposing undue costs of compliance on our industries within the EU.
I realize that this is your official purpose, but I don't think we can go into the details of the ETS. But I think if other countries think about adopting something similar, they should take a look at, as I said, at what happened in our manufacturing industry, which has not really, at least in my opinion, not really become more energy or CO2 efficient over the last years, at least. Basically, in my view, because of the free allowances. I understand the political imperative, but that is, I think, something that will come up later again. So certainly when we talk about the aim of, as you said, of preventing further carbon leakage. That is one of the key issues, or will be one of the key issues as we start negotiating also across countries. But I take your first point, which was that actually even isolating buildings, which directly has zero impact on the global economy, serves as a signal for other countries to what you're willing to do and what costs you're willing to sustain to reduce emissions.
Absolutely, and also signals what kind of, for example, building materials will meet increasingly rigorous standards within the EU as we try to increase energy efficiency. I didn't mean to suggest that the ETS was without criticism, and that we won't need to rethink its role, including the role of free allocation of allowances as we move from these incremental reductions that we've been achieving in the past to moving towards net zero. Obviously, if the ETS isn't driving the heavy industry within the EU towards climate neutrality quickly enough, other tools are going to have to come into play as well.
Okay, thank you. We have so far stayed domestic, and maybe David, looking at the EU from the other side of the Atlantic, you have a different opinion.
I'm not sure if it's so much a different opinion as just an American nuance. I don't know, maybe that's an oxymoron actually, but I'll do my best. It's great to see. It's great to see you, Daniel, and it's great to see Jake again. And thanks for having me and allowing me to do this this dialogue this morning. Jake probably knows my general spiel well enough that he could give it, and maybe I could play his role instead. But I'll try and sort of touch some more interesting and new ground as well. I think it's useful though to begin with a bit of a background context on sort of where the United States entered. Not even this year, where the United States entered late January after President Biden's inauguration. Where we've been thus far, where we're heading, and how we broadly see the U.S.'s role in international climate action this year. First of all, I think it goes without saying, although it's still nonetheless important to say, that the United States is returning to the global stage, and that there was, to some degree, a vacuum, but that there was a vacuum because it is important for the United States to be there in the global stage, acting on climate with like-minded partners and allies. It doesn't, by vacuum, we don't mean to say that there wasn't leadership. And in fact, there was very strong leadership from the EU in particular over the past several years. And the work that the EU has done was neither easy nor unappreciated over the past several years, and I think that's an important point to make at the outset. Nonetheless, it's important to also put this in context. The United States represents less than 15% of the world's emissions, and so while it is important that the U.S. has put forward a robust 1.5 degrees C aligned NDC 2030 climate target that builds on the previous Obama administration targets quite significantly, and now represents a targeted reduction of 50 to 52% by 2030, a halving of emissions. That this is only with respect to our own economy and our own economy's emissions. We also have a role to play in helping to mobilize the rest of the global economy in addressing the climate crisis. That was a large part of the rationale behind President Biden's Leaders Summit on Climate, which was held in late April. The Leaders Summit on Climate brought together heads of state from 40 different economies around the world, many major economies. It reconvened the Major Economies Forum, but it also highlighted and brought together heads of state from some other critical countries, either those on the front lines of the climate crisis, be it least developed countries, small island states, et cetera, or small and innovative countries that bring together a certain set of tools, capabilities, insights, experiences to the economy-wide as well as sectoral challenges that we're all going to be dealing with as we decarbonize. It was, I would dare say, a very successful summit. It resulted in significant new commitments by several important global economies. Japan announced that it will cut emissions 46 to 50% below 2013 levels by 2030, basically giving Japan a NDC that is aligned with keeping 1.5 degrees C within reach. Canada, the same, strengthened its NDC to a 40 to 45% reduction target from 2005 levels by 2030, which is a significant increase over its previous target. We launched the U.S.-India 2030 Climate and Clean Energy Agenda 2030 partnership, which is meant to mobilize and speed clean energy innovation and deployment this decade, including through mobilizing investment towards India's goal of 450 gigawatts of renewables by 2030. And if it hits 450 gigawatts of renewables by 2030, even though that's not a climate target, it's quite likely that that's going to put India on a path that will help the rest of us keep 1.5 degrees C within reach. In addition to this, there were several other major announcements. The UK, just before the summit, embedded in law 78% GHG reduction target. The EU, of course, put into law its target of reducing GHGs by at least 55%, truly leading the way for all others in attendance at the summit. Argentina and others strengthened their NDCs. The Republic of Korea announced that it will be, strengthening its NDC this year. And of course, we, just had the P4G summit in Seoul. And we had several other preview announcements of strengthened NDCs from South Africa and others. So it was a mix not only of wealthy economies or developed economies, but also countries, developing countries, those in the global South, that made new progress at the Leaders Summit on Climate. This is important, but not sufficient. And so we have a long road ahead of us over the rest of this year. We, of course, just wrapped up the ministerial of the G7, the Climate and Environment Ministerial, had a strong outcome there, thanks to strong leadership by the UK, but also very active participation and leadership by the EU and the US. We worked to get very strong language on international fossil fuel finance, international coal finance in particular, and language that we can carry forward in a strong way towards the G20, as well as in various different plurilateral and bilateral engagements over the rest of this year. And considering that coal is the single largest contributor to emissions that are driving the global climate crisis that we find ourselves in, it's an apt place to begin. It's an apt place to begin to make major progress after years of attention this year and heading into subsequent years. We, of course, will have the UN General Assembly, the pre-COP in Milan, all on the road to Glasgow. And here, this transatlantic cooperation and coordination will be as important as ever. I'm pleased to say that we've recognized this in Secretary Kerry's team. The first destination Secretary Kerry went to after President Biden was inaugurated was Europe, the first major US official to travel abroad. The first place he went after wrapping up the Leaders Summit on Climate was again Europe, to again coordinate on the next steps ahead. We've set up some various different mechanisms through which we'll be able to more closely coordinate, not just on what we're doing in our own economies, but also how we're trying to help move the rest of the world to decarbonize. Already coming out of the Leaders Summit on Climate, around 50% of the world's GDP have been committed to a 1.5 degree C aligned trajectory, a trajectory that will at the very least keep 1.5 degrees C within reach. Now it's incumbent upon us to tackle that remaining 45% or so, not just through requests and symbolism or symbolic diplomacy, but also through very real mechanisms to make it easier. For this reason, it's important to note that climate diplomacy is about mobilizing finance. Climate diplomacy is about innovation. And let me just mention, just very briefly, for one final minute, some of the exciting things that we're doing on the innovation front as well, because I see this as one of the real opportunities for early wins that can support our broader climate diplomacy efforts. The EU has taken major steps towards increasing its clean energy and climate R&D investments, I think nearly doubling them from an already high level. The United States and President Biden's budget envisions a 4x clean energy and climate R&D spending. At President Biden's climate summit, we previewed a jointly led effort along with the UAE, the Agriculture Innovation Mission for Climate, that will help to increase the amount of investment going into climate smart R&D, climate smart agricultural R&D, both in terms of mitigation and adaptation. We hope to launch this at the COP26 summit in Glasgow later this year. We also at the G7 with the EU and others announced the G7 Industrial Decarbonization Agenda, a platform for coordinating industrial decarbonization innovation, as well as standards, green procurement, driving demand for low carbon steel, low carbon concrete, et cetera, in a coordinated way across G7 countries. It's an important signal that the G7 is not just a forum for delivering lowest common denominator results, but it's a message that the G7 will tackle some of the hardest to abate sectors, not because they're easy, but because they are hard, because that is how you show leadership, and that is how you lower the cost of decarbonization, not just for your own economies, but for other countries, including developing countries and other major economies around the world. And that's going to be an important initiative to watch for coming out of the G7 Leaders Summit coming up here in just a couple of weeks and beyond. Now, what do we have on our agenda going forward? Well, in the innovation space, the US is not stopping. It's joining several new initiatives within the Clean Energy Ministerial, within Mission Innovation. It's going to be hosting the SEM and MI, Mission Innovation and Clean Energy Ministerial next year. And keep your eye out for additional exciting announcements in that space. We're working with a range, not just with the EU, but a range of different EU members, working with Denmark on a decarbonized shipping mission within Mission Innovation, for example. And there will be much work to be done among the EU and the US on innovation, since our innovation ecosystems, both in the public sector and in the private sector, are arguably some of the most intertwined in the world. But in addition, I think that we've got some exciting work to be done over the rest of this year as well. We're still only several months into this administration, still only several months into this revitalized transatlantic partnership on climate and the energy transition. And so I look forward to further work with the EU on things like addressing methane emissions, on things like making the international trade system a catalyst for additional climate action and incrementally increasing climate action. Rather than an anchor. Things like making sure our clean energy supply chains are robust, sustainable, trusted and ethical. These are the things that will take ambition, translate it into action, and do so in a way that creates a virtuous cycle. And there's, again, arguably no more important economy in the world for the US to be working with on this than our friends across the Atlantic and the European Union. So apologies, I've gone on for a while, but you have to understand we're making up for lost time, telling you where we've been, telling you where we're coming from, what we've done, and then of course telling you a little bit about where we're going over the rest of this year. So thanks very much, Daniel.
Thanks a lot, David. It is certainly, I was going to say, heartwarming for Europeans to have a new US administration which is in full harmony on this particular issue. But let me ask perhaps a few inconvenient questions. You emphasized your self-action, and at least viewed it from this side of the Atlantic. It's not quite clear how a presidential administration can translate commitments on climate change into action without having the support of Congress. I mean, in Europe, our situation is a little bit more comfortable in the sense that both national parliaments, plural, and the European Parliament are usually signed up to climate change and are willing also at least to make some sacrifices, less than it appears, as I have argued earlier, but some at least. Do you foresee that this will change in the US? Or do you think it can be achieved without cooperation from Congress?
I think that we're not counting on cooperation. Well, we're not counting on one particular piece of legislation one particular bill, one particular domestic set of actions, one particular domestic package in any singular way for any part of this overall climate target and our overall climate objectives in the United States. Look, we're all realists. We all understand what the balance of power is in Washington. We all understand what the dynamics are in Washington. And of course, the sophisticated observers on, watching this morning's or this afternoon's proceedings will understand that very well also. For this reason, we ran a very extensive interagency process in the development of that 2030 target. They gathered input from 24 agencies, departments, and various different offices across the US government that all participate in this national climate task force that we have that helped to sketch out the contours of this 2030 climate target. But we also consulted government leaders, importantly, from also state, local, tribal governments that, as you know, actually play an outsized role in the implementation of these sorts of climate targets, considering how much of energy policy, as well as various other policies across transport, built environments, agricultural sector, et cetera, have policymaking authorities that are devolved down beyond just the federal level. And so it's important to basically understand what are the different levers that are possible, looking at multiple different scenarios at multiple different levels of government. It is not to diminish in any way the importance of Congress and the importance of legislative action to help enshrine and to help make more durable some of the climate action that's going to be taking place under the Biden-Harris administration, in addition to that which has already taken place. But the point is that it's going to be a real mix, a mix of policies, a mix of investments, a mix of state, federal, local actions that are all going to have to take place in sort of a mosaic of climate action. Now, I understand that there are probably strengths and downsides of that approach. The downside is that it will be more difficult to, at any one single point in time, say, what is the most important action? What is the most important piece of legislation of all the different things that are now underway going on? On the other hand, it will arguably and hopefully make all of this climate action more embedded into the fabric of the American society, the fabric of the American economy, the fabric of the American federal, system of government, in a way that, in combination with market forces that reach a certain critical mass, a certain velocity, a certain point of no return, will make this march towards a virtuous cycle of increasing climate action somewhat inexorable, more difficult to reverse regardless of who happens to be sitting in the White House, of who happens to be controlling the House or Senate, the House or the Senate at any given point in time. And so we approach this as realists. We approach this sobered and very well understanding the recent history of global climate action over the past several years. But it's also not an excuse not to make every single effort across all levels of government to address this climate crisis, because it's not a partisan platform. It's not part of what a Democrat or Republican administration can achieve during their time in office. It's ultimately about getting various different aspects of our society aligned with the prosperity opportunities, the wealth creation opportunities in addressing the climate crisis, and also helping to take care of our most vulnerable communities as we face the climate crisis. So again, it's something we're very mindful of, but it's also something that we're not counting on any one single platform or package in terms of what goes through Congress in order to accomplish.
So in short, there will be no carbon price in the US. Jacob, do you think that is a problem for us?
Well, I'm not sure it's entirely true that there will be no carbon price in the US, but we'll see how things evolve over time. Let me start, Daniel and David. Thanks, David, for your remarks, and I think it's important for me to acknowledge that hearts have been warmed in Brussels as well by this transition from the previous administration to this one, both in terms of the position on climate policy, but also the embrace of the transatlantic relationship. And I think that there's a lot to build on. And in your remarks, you can see already a lot of the similarities in what we're trying to achieve, starting with action domestically, thinking then about how we can use that domestic leadership to persuade others in the way in which we and President Biden and Secretary Kerry have been reaching out to our major bilateral partners, and then finally through the support of the multilateral rules-based system, the Paris Agreement goals, but the other international organizations that David mentions that have some responsibility, some role to play in addressing these issues. So there's a lot of where we are beginning to align more and more, and that's going to provide more opportunities for us to work together. Clearly, the biggest mystery is what's going to happen next steps in terms of U.S. domestic policy. There was this very intensive interagency process that produced the 52% target, 50 to 52% target. But the analysis that sits behind that, I think we still are hoping to hear more details from where are the biggest potentials for reduction likely to lie, and what can we, as the EU, do to encourage the development of policies of the kind that David describes, which are most likely to endure any potential change in the makeup of Congress or any potential change in the administration. And we've been thinking and encouraging along similar lines. It's investments, significant investments in infrastructure, the development of standards that can shape today's markets and the markets of the future, working through multilateral processes to get the globe moving in the right direction, even if individual parties within the Paris Agreement falter at one step or another in the road towards net zero. So those are the kinds of things that we're very much looking forward to working with the U.S. administration once it becomes a bit clearer as to where the priorities will lie and what forms of administrative, executive, or legislative action are going to bring those forward. On the bilateral front, I think we have the same partners in mind as being the key determinants of whether we're going to reach the Paris goals or not. The other major economies are absolutely essential, and the US may be currently responsible for 15% of global emissions. The EU may be roughly half that. So we need to join forces, but essentially to bring the balance of those emissions on board, and we're definitely not there yet. The Biden summit, I think, was very helpful in accelerating some key announcements, but we all know that in order to be able to persuade the public that we're on track to keeping 1.5 in reach, that there's still a few key players missing from the equation that we have to figure out to bring on board. And I think one of the tests of that is, given what we were able to achieve in the G7, what are we now going to be able to achieve in the G20? Is there any of the examples that we set in terms of policies that we've committed to, in terms of levels of ambition that we've committed to in the G7, that will persuade others to come on board? And then the question is, if we don't, we have to figure out what additional voices do we need to bring to the EU's voice and to the US's voice to persuade major emerging economies that what they've done so far is not enough to fulfill their responsibilities in getting to net zero. We know part of that persuasion involves climate finance, both from public sources, but also from private sources. And we'll be looking to the US as to how they can accelerate and close the gap that was left by the previous administration in terms of providing public climate finance, but also testing their interest in working with us in setting standards that the private sector will have to follow if they're going to be able to credibly say to their shareholders, their investors, their consumers, that they are also on a pathway to net zero. And the EU has been working on standards around disclosure, the US is as well, but I think bringing that conversation together in a more coherent, cooperative way will be really important, given the influence that our two governments can bring to bear on private financial flows, which is very very considerable if we do things right. Yeah, so looking forward to. I told Daniel before our conversation that one of the challenges he might have as a facilitator of this is to try to find some differences between us in terms of what our near-term objectives are. So maybe I'll leave it to him to see whether he can try again to find some space between what the Biden administration and what this commission wants to achieve in the coming years.
I mean, one difference which I noticed between you was David emphasized very much the additional commitments which were made at the recent climate summit which President Biden hosted. Whereas you said we have to bring countries on board. So is it just a question of translating vague commitments into more concrete targets or action? And there, of course, I would be interested, does the EU recommend other people to have some carbon price, or does the EU say, we don't care how you do it, as long as you get the result? And I think then, once we have discussed that, I would like to come to the big elephant in the room, which is China, which I think was mentioned only en passant, which is very unusual in any discussion involving both Europeans and Americans. But perhaps, Jakob, you can first tell me whether my impression was wrong, that essentially we have the high-level commitments. What's left to be done? You muted yourself.
I expect this is another area in which David and I will agree, is that there are kind of two big dimensions of this target setting process. One is political, and in trying to demonstrate that all the major economies are aligning ourselves in terms of political objectives, and we characterize this in terms of committing to net zero as soon as possible in this century, to aligning our emissions trajectories with keeping 1.5 degrees within reach as the Paris goal sets for us. That setting of targets is absolutely key for the political messages that will come out of Paris, sending signals home to citizens, but also sending signals to the private sector, giving reassurances to the most vulnerable countries that we're actually taking our responsibilities as major economies seriously. We're not there yet. As David said, roughly, I'm not sure that we would agree exactly with these figures, but roughly half of those major emitters have now made commitments, or representing roughly half of global emissions, current global emissions, that could be characterized as aligned with 1.5. Well, you're not going to get to 1.5 until you have 100%.
Does the half include China?
That would be an interesting question to ask of David. From the EU's point of view, we don't think what China has publicly committed to so far can be characterized as being aligned with a 1.5 degree objective. They make up such a large percentage of current and future global emissions that they have to demonstrate that they're prepared to do more than what they've currently committed to. And I think that's going to become more and more obvious as time goes on and the science becomes clear as to where the emissions are coming from and the impact that those emissions are having. But it does include the EU, certainly. We think the US, certainly the UK, and a number of other countries of making. Japan, apparently, I don't know. I don't have a personal view on that, but I could certainly ask our analysts. But that's only one part of it. The balance of that is what are countries actually going to do with those goals? If we simply say commit to net zero and you're fine and we're all happy, of course that is just simply not the case. I mean, even the UN somewhat misleadingly characterizes the ambition gap is the gap between current commitments as if they were implemented and what the atmosphere needs to see in terms of actual emissions reductions. And we know that many goals have been set and missed in the past, and we need to insist on evidence that these goals aren't just political commitments, but they are effective domestic policy making. That's the question.
Can I press you on this point? What is the concrete evidence that countries provide that they are serious? A carbon price would be the easiest one.
Well, I see an economist turning again and again to a carbon price. I mean, that certainly, if that carbon price is based on real, effective, ambitious domestic policy, absolutely, that's one very important signal. And as you know, the EU has been a champion of carbon pricing as a cost-effective means of getting emissions under control, and it's what we've been promoting elsewhere. We don't see it as the only policy that works by any means, not even within the EU, as I explained before. But it's, if you take in a specific example, and David gave some as well, but it's China's elaboration of its 5-year plan. We need to be able to look under the hood of that 5-year plan and see whether or not the policies are aligning. It's China's preparedness to commit to phasing out the financing of coal, both domestically and overseas. It's the provincial peaking plans that we know are underway in terms of design in Beijing. And for any particular jurisdiction, you can run through what it is that we've all become very used to looking for evidence that countries are moving beyond goals to policymaking.
Thanks. I mean, perhaps, David, you can also give us your take on China. And then I wanted to come to the question of technology, which has appeared several times in the chat. But first, I think if you talk about the future of emissions, you both emphasize that the EU and the US together do about 20% of the global total. And the big emitters are China and, in the future, of course, India. And so what are these countries doing beyond their vague political commitments that makes you confident that they will actually be part of the climate diplomacy?
Well, these are both, they're both excellent questions. First, I don't have much more to add beyond what Jake said on China. I agree with him. I think about this at least 3 different levels. Number one, China doesn't yet have a net zero by 2050 target. It's difficult to imagine a world in which the globe reaches net zero emissions by 2050 if one of the largest, but also most capable, arguably, major economies in China doesn't reach net zero emissions by 2050. So that's first and foremost. As Jake also pointed out, though, just these net zero 2050 targets are woefully insufficient. We also, the latest analysis that I have seen, at least, and with the caveat that I'm not a deep expert on this, but the latest analyses I have seen suggest that even China's net zero by 2060 target does not yet have a necessary set of long-term strategies, nor short and medium-term actions that are consistent with meeting net zero by 2060, let alone 2050. So that sort of the bringing up of China's ambition into the 2050 time horizon on net zero has to also be met by just more, more detailed and credible actions consistent with that net zero trajectory. And then, third, I do think it is important to understand that much of China's emissions are exported in one way, shape, or form. And that includes the export of high carbon emitting infrastructure like coal generation. And so it's important as well that China or any other major economy is not taking steps, investments internationally that undermine either the existing ambitious NDCs or the capability to make more ambitious climate targets and take more ambitious climate actions in other countries as well. We need to be careful. This is a less, I think, kind of well-established, paradigm, but it's nonetheless very important, even if we're trying to wrap our head around it, that we need to make sure that our actions abroad facilitate increased climate ambition to the degree possible, rather than undermining the ability of other countries, let's say in non-OECD Asia, to be able to set and to meet ambitious climate targets. So that's on China. On broader major economies that are going to be critical to meeting this climate challenge, India, Indonesia, et cetera. I think there's absolutely an enormous opportunity here to help them. I think there is an enormous and pivotal decade ahead. We shouldn't, just those long-term targets are important, but when you are a fast-growing emerging economy, emerging market that is meeting energy demand at such a pace as India is, as Indonesia is, as Vietnam is, the next decade is absolutely critical, just because of how much investment is going into meeting that demand. And so the investment choices that are being made, the way that investment decisions are being framed, the way that energy market projections, the way that grid capabilities and grid possibilities are being framed, even in decision making, even in analysis, is actually critically important for the long-term climate goals, simply because of how much energy is being deployed, how much new investment is being deployed over the next several years. And so this is an area as well where it's not just the climate diplomats amongst us that are necessary to make a change in these economies, but it's also imperative and critical that our energy diplomacy, that our private sector engagement, that our collaborative efforts between, our energy modeling bodies in the EU, in the United States, the NRELs and the like, our universities, our academies, and again, those private sector capabilities are all being brought to bear to meet these climate challenges in these fast-growing emerging economies, simply because so much of the tangible changes that will come will be in the next several years, on the ground in terms of the, shaping how investments are made in either a cleaner, future for these economies, or locking in more emissions, which we absolutely, must avoid, and locking in the most polluting fuels, which we absolutely must avoid.
Thank you. I think you're quite right to point out that in a number of developing countries, the big investment phase is now, and if they all build coal-fired power station, then it will be very costly to change. And that's why, as an economist again, if I may say so, it's very important that in these economies you have a proper carbon price, so that it already pays today to use much more renewables instead of building a new power station. You mentioned earlier the target of India to install a very large amount of renewable capacity. One can achieve that perhaps by government fiat, that says now it has to be done, or by having a carbon price. Let me come back to what you said about China, which brings us again to the global issue. And I just read you here a question from Nicholas Ashford, MIT. Much of China's emissions come from exports to the developed world. If we want to decrease China's emissions, shouldn't we have to limit China's export? Which basically means, should we have a carbon tax, carbon border tax? Maybe that's something about which Jacob has reflected a lot.
Well, as I think I mentioned very briefly, part of the Fit for 55 package will include a Commission proposal for a carbon border adjustment measure, which is aimed at getting to this issue of how does a region, a Paris party like the EU, with a very large consumer population that is in the process of decarbonizing, ensure that as a result of that, we aren't simply importing more and more energy intensive goods from overseas and therefore not really addressing the fundamental problem, which is global emissions rise. And the carbon border adjustment measure will seek to address that through adjusting the price of products at the border on the basis of the price that they incur in the country of export. The details of how that is going to happen will be revealed the middle of July. I can't with confidence tell you exactly how it's going to work in practice, but it is aimed at acknowledging this phenomenon, which isn't just the case for China, but other countries that the EU trades in. If you want to keep an open market, but also decarbonize and not deindustrialize, it's very difficult to see how you can do that without making an adjustment at the border of some kind. There will be other trade-related aspects of the Fit for 55 package, and there are other trade-related aspects of existing European climate policy that also try to get at this. So when we began to promote the use of biofuels, we recognized immediately that if those were going to be used credibly as sources of renewable energy, we had to ensure that the whole supply chain of those biofuels was not leading to net emissions increases. And we would expect any country moving in the same direction to begin to ask hard questions about the process and production methods by which the products that they are importing have been made, and to take steps to try to make sure that, as I say, the overall net impact of their economy is not leading to increased emissions elsewhere.
I think the EU has to be careful because I realize that perhaps imports from China have a higher carbon content than our own production, but we are a major exporter. We have a current account surplus, a trade surplus. The US, by contrast, has a very large trade deficit. So the US would be much better placed to use a carbon border tax than the EU. David, what do you think?
Well, of course, these things are complicated, and the specific design, the specific coverage of any climate and trade instrument is ultimately what determines its balance, its impacts in the market, the leverage of a particular importer versus exporter in that scheme. And so I don't want to make broad presuppositions or assumptions based in the aggregate, because I think that the way that these things is most likely to evolve, as one sees in the EU's own carbon border adjustment measure, is the fact that you're going to go sector by sector and incrementally. But I will say that there's quite there's quite an interesting analysis to be done about the ways that we can encourage economies to become more carbon competitive, whether it's through trade mechanisms or otherwise.
Let me turn to another issue which has come up in the chat with several people asking questions about new technologies. I must admit, for somebody who's not a high-tech enthusiast, I sometimes have the impression that developing new technologies is the costless way out. There's no pain because we will become, just have high-tech, and that will deliver low carbon at close to zero cost. Now, what concrete elements do we have to say if we invest in new technologies, we can maintain our promises? And in particular, I'm thinking about the EU, which has, and perhaps also the US, which have concrete promises for 2030. If we invest now, today, in technology, it'll take a couple of years before we get first results, and then it will take years before that can be applied at an industrial scale. So can you tell me whether investment in technology today can have any significant bearing on our 2030 targets, or is it just an investment for the time beyond that?
I'm happy to take this initially. I think that it's important to have, we oftentimes, we're all guilty of this, oversimplifying the discussion around innovation and deployment and the relationship between the two. Let's be abundantly clear. Deployment of existing technologies is a very important and critical component of innovation, of developing better and more advanced technologies. We learn not just by studying, we learn not just in labs, but we also learn by doing. We also learn in the solar and wind fields. We also learn by equipping today's commercially ready carbon capture technologies and making them better for tomorrow, for example. And so innovation is not just something that is run through R&D budgets in labs and academies and universities across the United States and the European Union. But innovation is also something that's going to go on within companies as they deploy electrolyzers for green hydrogen, as they develop offshore wind, as they do all sorts of things, and incrementally, consistently look to discover new ways of compressing costs, of doing things more efficiently, of finding new materials, et cetera. That raises a second point, that the innovation we do in the classic sense, the R&D that we do in national labs, universities, within company R&D centers, even this is not necessarily always linear. You may set a target on the horizon for a certain goal you're looking to achieve, a certain reason you're doing that R&D. But so often, actually, our own upstream R&D, and in fact, this is true the further upstream you go, has interesting horizontal and unpredicted effects. So a technology that you might be looking to develop to create a better membrane for carbon capture could end up having knock-on effects that increase the efficiency of solar, or that allow us to achieve more energy efficiency in new buildings. And so it's important also to understand that R&D is something which just creates a general positive externality, but oftentimes is difficult to predict exactly how that positive externality is going to be channeled and into which technologies or which set of sectoral or policy objectives it's going to completely fall into. And so I think it's an unalloyed good in its own right, in the sense that just as carbon is an externality in many cases not fully priced into the economy, so too is innovation, and especially climate-oriented innovation, an externality, a positive one, not fully priced into the economy. We're not doing enough of it, in other words, and we're not doing enough of it in ways that, if we were to increase our innovation investments, it would have dividends that are difficult to predict, but I guarantee would fall across multiple different sectors and multiple different clean energy and climate technologies. And so, again, this is about marrying our deployment with our innovation, but coordinating our innovation efforts as much as possible. I think that's more important than choosing whether to innovate or not, but simply saying, how can we make sure that we're sharing information, knowledge gained among like-minded, trusted partners like the US, the EU, Japan, Canada, others? How can we make sure that all of this is targeted towards really concrete goals as much as possible? So delivering green hydrogen at XYZ costs, increasing the efficiency of offshore wind blades by XYZ%, right? These concrete goals rooted in the real world and rooted in our own deployment experiences that we're having, I think increases the synergies between those upstream innovation R&D efforts and the deployment of clean energy technologies that we have today.
So, I mean, it's really more about deployment, if you think about 2030, than developing entirely new technologies. Before I give you the word, the floor, Jacob, there was a participant who has asked for the floor, and maybe, Fanny, if you can put her on. We have a group of what we call young thinkers who participate in this Ideas Lab. And as you can imagine, many of them have an interest in climate change. And Celine, that is your occasion to ask a question.
Thank you very much. My name is Celine, I'm from Turkey, and I had a question kind of pertaining to the more transatlantic relations aspect, though you touched upon it a little bit. I want to ask how the differences in approach between the US and the EU, particularly in terms of, for example, in the infrastructure plan Biden has proposed, there's more of a clean electricity and energy standard as opposed to a carbon price, whereas the EU moves forward more with a carbon price. And broadly speaking, I guess we could characterize the US as relying more on technology developments and innovation, and the EU, while still incorporating these, as trying to implement more way of life sort of changes. Well, this was what the French environment minister had said. It's not my words personally. I was wondering how these sort of differences and potential divergences could play out in impacting future relations, especially in terms of the carbon border adjustment mechanism, and how that mechanism in particular, as implemented either by the EU or the US, could impact developing countries as well. Thank you.
Will you both give the same answer? Maybe Jacob first.
Well, it's a great question. Thanks, Celine. and it's a big question too. You packed a lot into that. I think that there will be differences in approach between what the policies that the EU rolls out and the policies that the US rolls out. There will be some similarities, but some differences as well. Whether those lead to political or trade or economic frictions, I think we still have to wait and see. I think we're doing everything we can at this stage to avoid that. But some of it, I think, will be inevitable. Maybe not so much in the negative sense, but in the positive sense. And let me be clear on that. You can see all the major jurisdictions that are committing to climate action selling that commitment in part as an industrial strategy, a strategy that's going to grow jobs, that's going to grow innovation, and that's going to lead their economy, their companies, their citizens to be the winners in this race to net zero. And that can work for many in many circumstances. There can be more than one winner, but there obviously will be an aspect of competition as well as to which companies move into the lead, which secure the standards that, in terms of, for example, product design standards that most benefit their manufacturers, which gain access to which markets most quickly. And so I think that there will be, even in a positive worldview outlook, some competition of a virtuous nature, but that will still create tension. So I think we have to be prepared for that as well. I can't really say much more about how the design of the CBAM, as we call it, the Carbon Border Adjustment Measure in the EU, is going to play out. What I can say is that we are designing it in a way, according to our instructions, that it will be WTO compatible, and that means that it has to meet the standard of equal treatment and even-handedness. It's got to be science-based, it's got to be non-arbitrary, and we will meet all of those standards. How that affects individual countries and individual producers within those countries in terms of the costs that they might need to bear in order to gain access to the EU market will have to be seen only when the final proposal emerges. I can say, as David suggested, we are starting with particular sectors and particular products that tend to impact more highly industrialized countries than least developed countries. So I don't think you will see any significant near-term effects on the poorest of developing countries. That doesn't mean it won't be controversial, but it does mean that, as I say, it will be even-handed, focused, surgical in its nature, and hopefully provides a model for other countries, including the US, that are looking to find ways of addressing this challenge of carbon leakage as well. So let me stop there. I probably only touched on a fraction of what you asked, but I did my best.
Thanks a lot. Surgical, I think, will be difficult, but it would be undoubtedly a major global political, or say, innovation, because there's no other major economy in the world which has a carbon border adjustment tax, or mechanism. So it would really be a first at the global level, and will certainly be tested, whatever, in courts, international institutions. And other countries will take a look at it and say, well, did it work or not? David, we are getting also very close to the allotted time. In Brussels, usually it's the Commission which has the last word. But for this time, I think you should have it. So perhaps you could conclude with an answer to Celine.
Well, thank you, Celine. It is an excellent question, and once again, I find myself agreeing so much with Jake that there's not too much to add. I'll simply just reiterate. Let me end where I began by just noting again, as has been noted several times, that the ambition and the actions taken to meet that ambition on the part of the United States and on the part of the European Union is admirable. The EU's ETS is an important mechanism for achieving the EU's climate goals. The EU's policy package Fit for 55 is a very exciting and important package to reach the next level of ambition. Similarly, we're very excited about the policies that are going to be rolled out here by the Biden-Harris administration. But let us also be global in our mindset and realistic. The transatlantic partnership is so important not because we are the node and nexus of global energy demand growth, the node and nexus of global emissions growth. Far from it. We're plateauing, we have peaked, we're plateauing, we're declining in terms of our emissions. And we're a small share, actually, combined of the world's emissions. And so we need to also be realistic about where the growth is in the world, where the global economic growth is, where the global energy demand growth is, where the global emissions growth is, and what we can do to address that together. That is why our partnership is also important. That's the second part of why this transatlantic partnership is so important. Because we bring together not just similar ambitions, but also kind of a similar ethos, similar principles, a similar outlook to addressing those emissions. And so we have companies, we have solutions, we have technologies that can address those emissions that ultimately may make a far bigger difference than even what we do incrementally within our own economies, even though our own steps to decarbonize our own economies are of paramount importance. Let me give you examples. We have companies in the United States like Boston Metal, for example, that's working on new electric steel making processes that are much lower emissions, much more efficient, and can also be very cost efficient. They may not make sense in much of the United States that already uses electric arc furnaces for much of its US steel making. And thus we have a very clean steel fleet. But it's an amazing opportunity to export to countries like Brazil or Russia or elsewhere that use more blast furnaces and have an enormous opportunity to leapfrog towards a much more efficient form of steelmaking. The EU similarly has its own examples. Sweden is host to H2 green steel, as well as to the hybrid consortium that's working on green steel in the EU. So there are solutions being born on both sides of the Atlantic. Neither the EU nor the US has a monopoly on this. And in fact, I would sort of disagree in a polite way with or challenge us to challenge our own shibboleths in terms of these accepted truths of the EU is not an innovative continent, but the US is. The US is not a capable, policymaker, regulator, but Europe is. We ultimately, if we're very honest with ourselves, share more commonalities than we might like to admit, for better or worse. And so I think the key thing is in interweaving our respective complementary strengths and weaknesses in a thoughtful way, so that competition, as Jake mentioned, is virtuous competition. And so that cooperation is done where it most makes sense and where it unlocks the greatest emission reduction opportunities globally. And that is going to be actually perhaps an even bigger impact that we make over the next decade, in addition to and beyond what we do within each of our respective economies.
Thanks a lot for these closing words. Friendly competition is, of course, any economist's dream. And he would just add that you have to have the appropriate price for externalities. But let me thank you, David and Jacob, for having been so patient with me and the audience, and having had this discussion where we have not discovered much of a disagreement, but even agreement between the two major powers on both sides of the Atlantic can be, as you mentioned, a very important driver of global change. Thank you very much again. And that is the end of our session today.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. Thanks again, David. Really